Everyone in our town believed my Aunt Eleanor had a perfect life, the kind people whispered about with admiration and envy, the kind that made women compare their marriages and men tip their hats in respect. But the night I opened the old cedar box hidden behind my mother's winter coats, I realized perfection was just a costume she wore well. And once I pulled one loose thread, the entire illusion began to bleed. Before this story pulls you deeper, take a second to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment if you believe every perfect family hides a secret, because what you are about to hear proves that truth in ways no one saw coming. I grew up watching Eleanor glide through life like nothing could touch her, married to a respected real estate developer named Richard Hale, living in a colonial house with white pillars and a porch swing that never squeaked, hosting charity dinners, smiling in framed photographs where everyone looked polished and safe, while my mother, her younger sister, worked double shifts and learned how to stretch silence over pain. Eleanor never raised her voice, never stumbled, never explained herself, and when people asked how she managed such a flawless life, she would tilt her head slightly and say, "Discipline, values, and faith," words that sounded clean enough to erase questions, and I believed her for years, because I was taught that adults who smiled like that had earned it. Everything changed when my mother passed away suddenly, leaving me at 23 with a grief that felt like it was chewing from the inside. And Eleanor stepped in with a practiced kindness, insisting I move into her guest room until I found my footing, telling everyone she was honoring family, though her eyes never quite softened when she looked at me, like she was measuring something invisible. Living under her roof felt like walking through a museum where nothing could be touched. Every surface cold and shining, every rule unspoken but enforced. And I learned quickly that Eleanor liked control more than comfort, liked silence more than truth, and liked being admired more than being known. I spent my days working remotely from the small desk in the guest room, nights listening to the house breathe, and weekends watching Eleanor perform perfection for neighbors and church friends, always reminding me to smile more, dress simpler, speak less, because image mattered, especially for women. The box appeared during a stormy afternoon when I was asked to clean the storage room, a place Eleanor avoided claiming dust allergies, and while sorting through old coats and unused holiday decorations, I found the cedar box wrapped in yellowed cloth, heavy locked and humming with the kind of importance you feel before you understand it. I did not mean to open it, but curiosity and grief are dangerous companions, and when the lock broke with a soft crack, the smell of old paper and something metallic filled the air, revealing letters, photographs, and a folded newspaper clipping that made my hands tremble. Before my mind caught up, the photographs showed a much younger Eleanor standing beside a man who was not Richard, her hair wild, her smile sharp, her hand resting possessively on his arm, and written on the back in faded ink was a date from 30 years ago and a name I recognized immediately: Daniel Brooks, a local man whose disappearance had become a whispered legend in our town, a man who vanished after a financial scandal that ruined several families, including my own. My father had lost everything in that collapse: his business, his reputation, and eventually his will to stay, leaving my mother alone to raise me with stories that avoided names but never avoided pain. I sat on the cold floor, heart pounding, flipping through letters that spoke of schemes, forged signatures, offshore accounts, and a shared plan to disappear before consequences arrived. Except Daniel vanished alone, and Eleanor stayed behind to rebuild herself as a victim turned saint. One letter ended abruptly, the handwriting jagged, accusing Eleanor of betrayal, of leaving him to take the fall, of promising to destroy evidence and never doing it. And as I read those words, something inside me shifted from shock to clarity, because suddenly my life, my mother's struggle, my father's absence, all traced back to the woman upstairs arranging flowers like she had never touched anything dirty. I understood then that Eleanor had not just survived the past, she had buried it under wealth and respectability. And the town helped her by never digging. I returned everything exactly as I found it, locked the box, and carried the weight of knowledge back to my room, knowing I had crossed an invisible line and could never return to ignorance. That night at dinner, Eleanor spoke about integrity and forgiveness while cutting her steak carefully, and I watched her hands steady and clean, imagining them 30 years ago signing papers that destroyed lives, and she caught me staring, her eyes narrowing just enough to warn me. From that moment, a quiet war began, one she did not know she was fighting, because I learned from her example that the most effective battles are fought with smiles, patience, and timing. I did not confront her, did not accuse, did not cry, because I understood something Eleanor had forgotten: the past only stays buried if no one is willing to tell it, and I had time, access, and a truth that refused to stay silent. Over the following weeks, I started asking gentle questions, pretending curiosity about family history, about old friends, about how she and Richard met, watching carefully as she edited her answers, skipping years, changing subjects, tightening her jaw when names came too close to danger, and every reaction confirmed what the box had already told me. I researched quietly at night, public records, archived newspapers, court documents that mentioned Daniel Brooks in footnotes, but never followed the trail far enough to reach Eleanor, because money and influence had closed doors long ago. But patterns do not disappear, they wait, and I was patient enough to see them. Eleanor noticed my calm, my compliance, my gratitude, mistaking it for weakness, inviting me to more events, placing me beside her like a harmless accessory, never realizing I was memorizing every crack in her mask. The girl she underestimated was the same girl who inherited her mother's resilience and her father's stubborn sense of justice. And as I stood beside Eleanor at a charity gala one evening, listening to applause rise for her generosity, I made a silent promise to myself that the truth would surface, not loudly, not messily, but slowly, deliberately, and in a way that would leave her standing alone in the wreckage of the life she built on lies. After that night, I stopped seeing Eleanor as my aunt and started seeing her as a carefully constructed character who survived by controlling every narrative around her. And once you recognize a lie, you also begin to see how much effort it takes to maintain it, effort that eventually creates cracks, especially when the liar believes they are untouchable. I became observant in ways grief had never taught me before, noticing how Eleanor scheduled her charity appearances strategically around town gossip cycles, how she donated just enough to silence suspicion, how Richard trusted her completely because trust was easier than questioning a woman who made his life comfortable and his image respectable. I learned that Richard handled present wealth while Eleanor guarded past secrets, and that division of power was what kept their marriage strong, because neither stepped into the other's territory. I used that to my advantage. I began helping Eleanor with her paperwork, offering to organize old documents, claiming I wanted to learn responsibility and gratitude, and she accepted without hesitation, pleased by my obedience, never considering that the same hands sorting tax records and donation receipts could connect dots she had worked decades to scatter. Slowly, I mapped her financial history, noticing sudden jumps, unexplained transfers, shell foundations that existed only on paper, and a pattern that pointed back to the year Daniel Brooks disappeared, the year several investors lost everything, the year Eleanor reintroduced herself to the town as a grieving friend who had been deceived like everyone else. The story was elegant, simple, and false. I took notes in a private digital folder disguised as work files, naming nothing directly, labeling dates and amounts, letting facts speak without emotion, because emotion clouds credibility, and credibility was what Eleanor valued most. At the same time, I played the role she expected, attending church, smiling politely, thanking her publicly for her generosity, letting neighbors praise her kindness in front of me while I nodded, storing every compliment like evidence of what she stood to lose. Eleanor started confiding in me more, perhaps sensing loyalty, perhaps enjoying the power of mentorship, telling me stories about sacrifice, about how women must sometimes do hard things to protect their families, statements that felt rehearsed, yet revealing like a confession wrapped in advice. One afternoon, while we were alone in the kitchen, she mentioned Daniel Brooks, casually, referring to him as a tragic man who ruined himself through greed, watching my face carefully for reaction. And I kept my expression neutral, asking only how she knew him, prompting her to repeat the sanitized version she had perfected. And when she finished, I thanked her for sharing, leaving her slightly unsettled by my calm acceptance. That was when I understood fear works best when it has no clear target. My research led me to an investigative journalist named Mark Ellison, who had written a brief piece years ago questioning inconsistencies in the Brooks case, an article that gained little traction and quietly disappeared, and I reached out anonymously, presenting myself as someone with family ties and unanswered questions, not yet revealing Eleanor, because timing mattered. Mark responded cautiously, curious but guarded, explaining that pressure and legal threats had shut down deeper investigation back then. And as we exchanged messages, I realized Eleanor's influence extended further than I imagined, enough to scare professionals into silence. That did not stop me, it clarified the battlefield. Instead of chasing exposure directly, I focused on something Eleanor could not control: her reputation within the social structures she relied on most. I began volunteering more actively in her charities, positioning myself near board members, listening rather than speaking, learning How power moved through polite conversation and shared dinners, discovering that admiration was conditional and loyalty shifted quietly when doubt entered the room. I never accused, never hinted explicitly, but I asked questions that lingered, questions about transparency, about old financial practices, about accountability standards that had evolved since the early 90s, watching as Eleanor stiffened when discussions drifted too close to her past methods. Meanwhile, Richard started noticing small tensions. Eleanor, shorter temper, her increased need to control minor details, her irritation when I handled tasks she once enjoyed, and although he did not suspect the truth, he sensed imbalance, and imbalance in a marriage built on image creates anxiety. One evening, Richard asked me privately if Eleanor seemed stressed, and I responded honestly without revealing anything, saying she carried a lot on her shoulders, and perhaps never truly rested, planting the idea that perfection demanded a price, and from that moment, Richard began watching her too. The turning point came when Eleanor announced a major charity fundraiser celebrating her 30 years of community leadership, an event designed to cement her legacy, attract media attention, and frame her as untouchable history rather than a questionable one. And as she planned it obsessively, I realized this was the stage the truth needed, not through scandal, but through exposure layered beneath admiration. I contacted Mark again, this time providing verifiable documents, redacted but undeniable, asking him to review patterns without names, and his tone shifted from curiosity to urgency, recognizing the significance of what I had uncovered. At the same time, I arranged for an independent audit within one of Eleanor Foundations under the guise of modernization, suggesting it would enhance donor confidence, and Eleanor agreed reluctantly, unwilling to appear resistant to transparency, not knowing that audits do not care about reputations. Weeks passed with tension thickening the air, Eleanor pacing more, snapping at staff, questioning my loyalty indirectly, while I remained calm, supportive, present, because the most dangerous threat is the one that does not flinch. The audit uncovered irregularities, not enough alone to destroy her, but enough to trigger mandatory reporting, and suddenly conversations shifted. Lawyers appeared, board members distanced themselves subtly, and Eleanor's smile became strained, her charm less effective as whispers replaced applause. She confronted me one night, asking directly if I knew something, her voice controlled but her eyes sharp with suspicion, and I met her gaze steadily, telling her only that truth has a way of resurfacing when it is ignored too long. A statement vague enough to deny yet precise enough to haunt. That was when fear finally entered her world visibly, because Eleanor had built her life assuming the past was dead, not dormant, and she realized too late that someone had woken it. Richard began asking harder questions. Mark prepared a story contingent on final confirmation, and the town that once admired Eleanor started reevaluating memories, noticing inconsistencies they had dismissed for years. I did not feel joy, only a heavy sense of inevitability. Understanding that revenge does not feel like victory, it feels like balance restored at a cost. No one escapes. As Eleanor's world tightened, she attempted damage control. Donations increased. Apologies issued for vague misunderstandings. But generosity without honesty only highlights desperation, and the foundation she stood on began to crumble silently beneath her. I watched all of it from within. The girl she invited into her home believing she could control, now the one holding the key to her undoing. Not out of hatred, but out of a need to correct a lie that had shaped too many lives, including my own. By the time the fundraiser date arrived, the house no longer felt like a sanctuary of perfection, but a stage crowded with invisible tensions, every hallway echoing with conversations that stopped when I entered, every phone call Eleanor took ending abruptly, and I understood that fear had finally made her aware of her own vulnerability, though she still did not know exactly where the blade would fall. The night of the event unfolded exactly as she planned. On the surface, elegant guests, soft music, speeches filled with gratitude, and moral language cameras, capturing her smile from every angle, and as I stood near the back of the hall, watching it all, I felt the strange calm that comes when preparation replaces emotion. Mark had not published anything yet, the audit report had not gone public, and Eleanor believed she still had time to maneuver, unaware that the most effective exposure is not sudden, but cumulative, allowing people to connect dots themselves until denial becomes impossible. During the opening speech, Eleanor spoke about legacy, about truth, about standing firm in difficult times, words that sounded noble but landed hollow to those who had begun questioning her. And I noticed subtle changes in the room: polite applause that lacked warmth, glances exchanged between board members, a hesitation that never existed before. After dinner, a respected donor approached me privately, asking how long I had lived with Eleanor, what kind of woman she was behind closed doors, and I answered, carefully describing her discipline, her intensity, her need for control, offering observations without accusations, letting the donor interpret meaning, and by the time he walked away, his expression told me the spell was weakening. Eleanor watched these interactions closely, her posture rigid, her smile practiced but strained, and when she took the stage again to announce a new initiative, her voice faltered just slightly enough for someone listening closely to hear uncertainty beneath confidence. The following week, the audit findings were formally submitted, triggering a review that Eleanor could not influence directly, and suddenly her name appeared in quiet conversations with words like inquiry and compliance attached, phrases that do not accuse but do not absolve either. Richard grew distant, not hostile, but cautious. Asking Eleanor for explanations she struggled to provide without revealing more than she intended, and I watched their marriage shift from partnership to negotiation, trust replaced by assessment. One evening, Richard sat with me on the porch, asking about my parents, about my childhood, about what loss teaches you, and I realized he was trying to understand the kind of person who could live with grief and still remain composed. And I told him the truth, that loss forces clarity, that once something is taken from you unfairly, you begin to see injustice everywhere. And although I never mentioned Eleanor directly, the implication lingered between us, like a shared understanding forming quietly. Mark contacted me again, confirming he had verified the documents, uncovered additional records connecting Eleanor to shell entities linked to the Brooks collapse, and was preparing a story that focused not on scandal, but on accountability. A narrative that asked why some people escape consequences while others disappear. And I approved, knowing that framing mattered more than outrage. When the article published, it did not accuse Eleanor outright of crimes long expired by statute, but it dismantled her moral authority piece by piece, presenting timelines, financial movements, and unanswered questions that invited scrutiny. And within hours, the town buzzed with shock disguised as concern. Eleanor attempted a public response, issuing a carefully worded statement about misinterpretations and historical complexity. But the damage was already done, because once people question integrity, explanations sound defensive rather than reassuring. Invitations slowed, board members resigned, citing personal reasons, donors paused, contributions pending review, and the social armor Eleanor wore so confidently began slipping, revealing a woman unaccustomed to standing without applause. At home, the atmosphere turned cold, Eleanor no longer performing kindness, her control slipping into sharp commands, her fear transforming into anger directed at everyone but herself. And when she finally confronted me directly, accusing me of betrayal, of poisoning perceptions, I listened silently, allowing her to exhaust herself, because people reveal more when they feel wronged. She demanded to know why I would do this, why I would destroy the family that took me in. And I responded calmly that families built on lies eventually collapse under their own weight. That truth does not destroy, it exposes what was already broken. And for the first time, Eleanor looked genuinely afraid, not of consequences, but of being seen clearly. Richard overheard part of the exchange, his presence altering the dynamic instantly. And Eleanor shifted tactics, appealing to loyalty, to history, to shared sacrifice. But Richard asked one simple question that cut deeper than accusation, asking whether there was anything else he did not know, and her silence answered more than words could. In the days that followed, Richard moved into the guest room, lawyers were consulted, and Eleanor's world shrank rapidly, reduced to damage control meetings and sleepless nights. While I prepared for the final step, the one Eleanor could not anticipate, I met with Mark in person, handing over the last piece of evidence, a letter from Daniel Brooks, written weeks before his disappearance, explicitly naming Eleanor as the architect of the financial maneuver that collapsed the investment group. And although it could not bring legal punishment decades later, it carried moral weight that no amount of charity could offset. The follow-up article focused on that letter, on the families ruined, on the silence maintained, and on the woman celebrated while others paid the price. And this time, the reaction was immediate and irreversible. Eleanor resigned from all boards, her 30-year celebration quietly erased from promotional material, her name removed from plaques and donor lists, and the town rewrote its memory without ceremony, distancing itself from a figure who no longer served as moral reference. I watched Eleanor retreat inward, her control gone, her perfection irrelevant, and I felt no triumph, only a strange release, like a pressure that had been pressing down on my chest since childhood finally lifting. Richard filed for separation, citing irreconcilable differences. And although he never thanked me directly, his quiet nod when we passed in the hallway acknowledged an understanding that needed no words. Eleanor prepared to leave the house, her movements slow, her authority gone, and as she packed, she asked me one final question, whether I felt satisfied, and I answered honestly that satisfaction was not the goal, truth was, and that once truth surfaced, what people did with it was beyond my control. She left without another word, her perfect life unraveling not in flames, but in silence. The way all carefully maintained illusions end, and as the door closed behind her, I understood that revenge does not always require cruelty. Sometimes it only requires patience and the courage to let the past speak. After Eleanor left the house, the silence she had always controlled became something entirely different, no longer disciplined and polished, but hollow, echoing with the absence of authority, and for the first time since I arrived, the space felt honest. Richard moved through the days quietly, sorting legal documents, canceling joint accounts, dismantling a life he once believed was built on mutual values, and I watched him process betrayal not with rage but with exhaustion, the kind that comes when admiration collapses into understanding. The town followed a similar pattern, outrage briefly flaring before settling into discomfort. Because people do not like admitting they were fooled, especially for decades. And yet the conversations continued, subtle at first, then more direct, teachers whispering, donors asking questions, old investors' families finally naming what they had swallowed for years. I received messages from strangers who recognized my last name, who remembered my father, my mother, the quiet downfall of families no one defended, and they thanked me not for revenge but for articulation, for giving shape to a pain that had been ignored long enough to feel invisible. That was when I understood that this story was never just about Eleanor, it was about how easily communities accept convenient lies when they come wrapped in charm and generosity, and how costly that acceptance becomes for those without power. Mark articles sparked further inquiry beyond our town, drawing attention from regional outlets, historians revisiting old cases, journalists connecting Eleanor named to patterns that extended further than Daniel Brooks, and although no criminal charges could follow, the moral verdict was decisive, erasing her public standing entirely. Eleanor attempted to defend herself once more through a carefully arranged interview, but the woman who once commanded rooms now struggled to command sympathy, her explanations sounding rehearsed, her justifications hollow, and the interviewer gentle but firm, allowing contradictions to surface naturally, letting Eleanor dismantle her own narrative under the weight of questions she had avoided her entire life. When the interview aired, reactions were swift and final, not cruel, not loud, but dismissive, and dismissal is far more devastating to someone who lived on admiration. Richard finalized the separation, choosing a quiet settlement that avoided spectacle, and although he lost financially, he regained something more valuable, the ability to sleep without defending illusions. And before I left the house for good, he thanked me in a way that carried no resentment, only clarity, telling me that truth, even when painful, had freed him from a life he did not realize was constricting. I moved out shortly after, not because I was asked to leave, but because my purpose there had ended, and staying would have turned resolution into stagnation. One rented a small apartment across town, modest but mine, filled with light rather than perfection, and began rebuilding my own life without the shadow of inherited lies. Eleanor disappeared from public view, relocating quietly, her name now spoken only as a cautionary tale, and although I never sought updates, they reached me anyway, whispers of isolation, of attempts to justify herself to those unwilling to listen, of a woman discovering too late that control without trust leaves nothing behind. One afternoon, I received a letter forwarded from my old address, Eleanor handwriting, unmistakable even without seeing her name, and for a long time, I did not open it, unsure whether revisiting her voice would reopen wounds that had finally begun to close. When I did read it, the letter surprised me, not with apology but with reflection, Eleanor admitting not guilt exactly but awareness, acknowledging that she had mistaken survival for righteousness, that she believed success erased responsibility, and that she underestimated the cost of silence, especially to those who inherited its consequences. She did not ask forgiveness, perhaps understanding she was not entitled to it, but she asked one question, whether I believed she had ever been good, and I sat with that question longer than expected, realizing that people are rarely one thing entirely, that even those who cause harm often begin with fear rather than malice, but fear does not absolve damage. I never responded to the letter, not out of cruelty, but because closure does not always require conversation. Sometimes it requires boundaries. Months passed, and life settled into a rhythm that felt earned rather than maintained. My work steady, my nights quiet, my mind no longer burdened by secrets that were never mine to keep. Occasionally, I walked through town and noticed the absence of Eleanor influence. Charity events simpler, leadership rotating, transparency emphasized, and although no one credited me publicly, the shift itself felt like acknowledgement enough. Mark moved on to other investigations, but he sent me a final note, thanking me for trusting the process rather than demanding spectacle, reminding me that real change often arrives quietly, reshaping structures rather than headlines. On the anniversary of my mother's death, I visited her grave, telling her everything I never had the chance to say about the box, the letters, the truth she never knew but always felt, and as I stood there, I felt a peace that had nothing to do with victory and everything to do with alignment, the sense that something broken had been corrected, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to let the future breathe. I realized then that revealing the past had not just unraveled Eleanor's life, it had restored a narrative stolen from too many people, including myself, and although the cost was high, the alternative would have been higher still, living silently beneath a lie polished so well it convinced even its creator. As I walked away, I understood that revenge is a word people use when they cannot imagine justice without cruelty. But what I had done was neither cruel nor kind, it was necessary, and necessity carries its own weight, one that does not ask permission or forgiveness, only courage. Time has a way of softening noise without erasing meaning, and as the months turned into a year, the story of Eleanor slowly shifted from scandal to lesson, no longer discussed with shock but with reflection. As people began to understand that perfection presented too loudly often hides the most carefully buried truths, I settled fully into my new life, one built not on appearances but on honesty, learning that peace feels different when it is not borrowed from someone else's image. I changed my routines, my social circles, my expectations, allowing myself to exist without measuring my worth against inherited standards, and in that space, I discovered how deeply silence had shaped me, how many choices I once made to avoid discomfort rather than pursue truth. The town continued, evolving, leadership changing hands, policies tightening, transparency becoming less of a buzzword and more of a requirement, and although Eleanor's name was rarely spoken anymore, the structures she once manipulated now carried safeguards designed to prevent history from repeating itself. Occasionally, I encountered people who once praised her, now embarrassed by their blindness, and instead of resentment, I felt understanding, because denial is often easier than accountability until someone forces clarity. One afternoon, while organizing my files, I came across the digital folder where it all began, the dates, the transfers, the patterns that once consumed my thoughts, and instead of revisiting them, I deleted the folder entirely, not as an act of forgetting, but as an acknowledgement that the past had served its purpose and no longer deserved my energy. I realized then that my role was never meant to be permanent, that truth needs carriers only until it can stand on its own, and once it does, clinging to it becomes another form of control. Eleanor never reached out again, and from what little I heard, she lived quietly, stripped of influence, facing the consequences of a life spent managing perceptions rather than confronting responsibility. And although some might call that punishment insufficient, I understood that losing the narrative you built your identity around is a collapse few recover from. Richard rebuilt his life slowly, focusing on substance over status, and when our paths crossed briefly at a local event months later, we exchanged a simple nod, to people acknowledging a shared chapter closed without bitterness. I continued receiving occasional messages from families impacted by the Brooks collapse, some thanking me, some simply sharing their stories, and I listened when I could, understanding that exposure opens doors, not just to justice, but to healing conversations long overdue. On a quiet evening, I returned to the old neighborhood one last time, walking past the colonial house with white pillars now occupied by new owners, the porch swing replaced, the windows glowing with unfamiliar warmth, and instead of pain, I felt release, knowing that places lose their power when the stories tied to them are resolved. I thought about Eleanor's final question from her letter, whether she had ever been good, and I realized that goodness is not a permanent state but a series of choices, and the ones that matter most are made when no one is watching. As I walked away, I felt gratitude, not for the struggle itself, but for what it taught me, that revealing the past is not about destroying people, it is about refusing to carry lies that were never yours to protect. I understood then that the girl who uncovered the truth did not do so out of revenge alone, but out of a need to reclaim her own narrative, to ensure that silence did not become inheritance. The story ended not with Eleanor's downfall alone, but with my freedom from a history that once defined me without my consent. And that freedom felt quiet, steady, and deeply earned. Before this story closes, if it made you think, if it reminded you that truth always finds a way back, take a moment to like the video. Subscribe for more real stories like this, and comment your thoughts below. Because conversations like these keep honesty alive long after the headlines fade.